Thank you, Dr. Mele, for that very friendly and kind welcome. And it is very good to be back home, where I spent 6 years as a student in the late 50s and early 60s. My topic is Husserl on First Philosophy. Husserl's philosophical influence has gone through high and low periods for over a century. But since his initial engagement with Frege in the 1890s, he has continuously been a player on the cultural scene. There were times when he was overshadowed by some other figure or movement. He was somewhat eclipsed by Heidegger in the late 1920s and the 1930s, and by postmodernism in the last part of the 20th century. But each of these periods was followed by a substantial resurgence. And even now, interest in his work is showing up in places where it had not been visible in the past. We can apply to his philosophical work the motto of the city of Paris, fluctuat nec mergitur. It is tossed about, but it never sinks. And I think we all agree that Husserl's phenomenology is now safely ensconced in the cultural firmament, far from the turbulence of our sublunar world, where authors devour or clamber over one another in the struggle for survival. Husserl's philosophy did not just have its day in the sun, it has joined these celestial bodies. It has become something like a separate intelligence, a presence and a power beyond the vicissitudes of change. In my talk, I'm going to have 4 parts, and I begin now the first, which is Husserl and the perennial issues of philosophy. I would like to offer a specific explanation for the continuing attraction and influence of Husserl's thought. It's not just that he provides a number of valuable and attractive analyses, such as his descriptions of categoriality, perceiving, temporality, memory, corporeality, and logic. More fundamentally and more comprehensively, the reason his work endures is that it restores philosophy itself. Husserl clarifies what it means to enter into the philosophical life. He clarifies first philosophy, proto-philosophia, as a theoretic venture, and he used the name Erste Philosophie for a course he gave in the winter semester of 1923-24. Husserl recovers philosophy. He opens or revives a prospect that is always threatened by obscurity and always needs to be refreshed. As Thomas Pruffer, an American philosopher who was a colleague of mine, as Thomas Pruffer writes, quote, "Philosophy is perennial, but it is also ephemeral. It is continually being blurred and destroyed and transformed into something not itself. And so, if we wish to philosophize, we are continually faced with the task of rediscovering and restoring philosophy." End quote. Husserl shows how philosophy is a distinct form of thinking, and he shows how it differs from other forms, in particular those of the various sciences and worldviews. He does this in his discussion of the transcendental reduction, in which he examines how we take up a stance that is different from all the partial and practical attitudes that we have. In the epoche and reduction, we stand back and look at the whole of things, including our own being as part of the whole. In his many efforts to define his transcendental phenomenology, Husserl has, in effect, been reconnecting with classical philosophy, which, in its Aristotelian formulation, theorizes being as it looks to the whole of things. Husserl's treatment of the transcendental reduction and his description of the phenomenological attitude justify all his particular analyses. He's able to show how and why these analyses are not just empirical or psychological, but philosophical. And he also shows that his analyses are apodictic. Through his work, we can see why philosophy not only can be apodictic, but why it must be such. Husserl explicitly defines the philosophical life, which is the life dedicated to truth in its unrestricted and most comprehensive form. To more vividly define Husserl's achievement, let us consider for a moment the development of ancient philosophy. The philosophical figures we study in the history of ancient thought are not a random collection. There's a unified progression through the pre-Socratics, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and the Neoplatonists. They all developed philosophy as a way of knowing and as a way of life dedicated to knowing. They all recognize the being, the intelligibility, and the good of things. These thinkers do not all say exactly the same thing. Each of them brings out aspects that others may have neglected. But even as they bring out something original, they usually let something else slide into obscurity. Gains are accompanied by losses. This is the grand narrative of classical philosophy. Over against this narrative, however, we can also discern counter-philosophical pressures, ways of thinking that counteract philosophy and question its very possibility. And these counter-philosophical positions are not just Greek and Roman, but perennial. They are as enduring as philosophy itself. Two of the most prominent non-philosophies of the ancient world are reductive atomism, found in the original Democritean atomists and in the Epicureans, and, on the other hand, sophistry and historicism, found in the original sophists. The atomists were a kind of scientific substitute for philosophy, while the sophists represented a historicist or relativistic alternative. Philosophy always has to define and defend itself against these two opposing forces. The struggle to do so is endemic to the human condition. Because there is such a thing as philosophy, there also are counterfeits that are played off against it, things that only look like or claim to be philosophy. Now, Husserl offers the possibility in our day and age of a return to first philosophy. In Aristotle, first philosophy is defined as the theorizing of being as being. It is also called metaphysics, even though it was not given that name by Aristotle himself. The book in which Aristotle carries out this first philosophy was entitled Ta Metaphysica by its editors. They called it a study of issues that are beyond the physical things. Going beyond the physical things is often thought to be an effort to deal with separate, non-material substances, but it does not just mean only that. In fact, the study of separate entities comprises only a small part of Aristotle's metaphysics. His first philosophy spends most of its time examining things like predication, truth and falsity, contradiction, substance and accidents, definition, form and substrate, and the potential and the actual. Metaphysics theorizes truth. It is the theoria tes aletheas. It's called that in the second book of the Metaphysics. And the human attainment of truth is an achievement that goes beyond any physical process. Philosophy goes beyond physics because logic, truth, contradiction, and predication, for example, and the grasp of definitions are not among the motions that occur in simply material entities. They are beyond the physicals, metaphysica. They belong to being as being and not to being as material or mobile. And so when Aristotle turns to the examination of being as being, he also turns to the study of intellect as intellect, or mind as mind. This is also what Husserl does. We could define his phenomenology as the study of intellect as intellect, mind as mind, or reason as reason. Perhaps it would be most appropriate to call it the study of truth as truth. In order to venture out on this study, Husserl needs to differentiate his inquiry from something less ultimate, just as Aristotle did. But Husserl does not distinguish his first philosophy from the study of physical things. In his day and age, he needs especially to distinguish it from psychology. So a book containing Husserl's first philosophy could appropriately have been entitled Ta Metatapsychika, or the Metapsychics. And just to round out this set of comparisons, we might also observe that Plato too moves into a first philosophy by contrasting it against a less ultimate science, and in his case it is mathematics. Plato's first philosophy could appropriately have been called something like ta meta ta mathematica, or the meta-mathematics. Now, I would like to add yet another way in which Husserl moves beyond a lower science in order to move on to first philosophy. He himself does not highlight this approach, but I think it's present in his writings and that it deserves attention. It could be considered a distinct way to the transcendental ego, along with what Izo Karen has called the Cartesian ontological and psychological ways to reduction. Husserl goes beyond the world given to the natural attitude. He looks at the way we are in our involvement with things, and he looks at the world in its human involvement. But he also goes beyond psychology, but he also goes beyond what we could call the apophantic domain, the realm of meaning and propositions, which Frege calls the realm of sense, of Sinn. In doing this, Husserl moves beyond logic as an apophantic science, which studies the structures of this domain of meaning. In formal and transcendental logic, he distinguishes the apophantic domain and its formal logic from the transcendental subject and its transcendental logic. Husserl's first philosophy, consequently, could be called the science of ta meta ta logica, or ta meta ta apophantica. His science presupposes and examines the kind of truth we achieve in our experience of things, in the truth of correctness, and in the questions raised by formal logic.